Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. My name's Abby Huseth. I'm a graduate student in the Environmental Studies Department here, and I'm working with the group that is coordinating this event tonight, Faith and Climate Action Montana, which is a coalition of clergy, people of faith, and environmental groups working to engage faith communities on climate change. I'd like to thank Missoula Community Access Television, who will be videotaping tonight's conversation as part of their Media Assistance Grants program to nonprofit organizations. So this program should be viewable for those here and who couldn't be here tonight. Just a word, the inspiration for tonight's conversation, I think, comes from a shared sense of urgency to address climate change and the conviction that people of faith have an important role to play. Tonight's conversation will cover what's at stake at the upcoming climate change negotiations in Paris, what faith leaders are saying about climate change, and what we can do to get involved. We are really grateful to have a great panel of speakers tonight. We have Len Broberg. He's a professor of environmental studies here at the U, and he'll be attending the Paris conference later this month. We have Reverend Joseph Carver, who's the pastor of St. Francis Xavier Church here in Missoula, and Dan Spencer, a professor of environmental studies, ordained UCC minister and co-author of the upcoming Earth Ethics, and Caroline Lauer, the program associate with Climate Smart Missoula. Each of the speakers will give a short presentation, and then we'll have time for audience questions at the end. With that, I'll pass the mic to Len to get us started.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you to everyone that's putting this event together. I think it's a great opportunity for us to consider these issues through the lens of faith. And my charge is really to lay out where we are headed into the Paris climate talks, and I'll briefly introduce what that means and kind of lay the foundation for these other folks, good folks that are going to follow me. I need to apologize to you, the audience, and to my other speakers that I've stupidly double-booked myself tonight. So as soon as I'm done speaking, I actually need to leave to go and do an introduction and another talk here on campus tonight. So I apologize to you all for that, but I leave you in these capable folks' hands after my initial remarks. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the background of climate change because I'm sure most of you are aware of it if you're here, but we're basically at a level of CO2 that we have not seen previously in recorded human history. We are faced with the prospect then to deal with what might follow from this level of anthropogenic emissions, human-caused emissions, to make reductions in the long term. But something that I think is a little bit undersold is the fact that really the immediate need is to find a way to peak total global human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. This slide shows what happens if we had frozen the climate, or the atmosphere rather, at the concentrations that were present in the year 2000. And what it shows, as you can see with the increase in global mean temperatures that happened despite that freezing of the amount of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases, is that temperature continues to increase for quite some time. This is because of the physics of the atmosphere, the feedback loops that are present in the atmosphere, and the different lines really here are kind of showing the possible different sensitivities of our climate to the amount of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it's not so important that you focus on any one line. It's more that even if we stop now, temperature would increase for quite some time to come. And so the immediate need, too, is to look at not only long-term, what are we going to do in 2050, but how can we craft a way to peak our emissions as soon as possible, which will be as inexpensive a manner of dealing with climate change as we can arrive at. So Just a little background on the Paris climate talks and the organization that puts them on. It's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a UN organization. This is the same organization that created the IPCC back in the early 1990s and that crafted the Kyoto Protocol, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. But just as a quick summary, this was an agreement where the developed countries of the world agreed to limit or reduce their emissions through the year 2012, beginning at about 2008 or 2009 and going on to 2012. This was only a commitment of the developed nations. The way the UNFCCC protocols have been set up is that there is a difference between developed and developing nations. This is in part to recognize the fact that developed countries have actually largely put us in the state that we're in today, and therefore bear a responsibility for a lot of this commitment that we have, much more so than the developing world. But what has emerged in recent years since the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol is that the developing world could not be neglected in this process, and that there were issues around their emissions that, as a group of countries across the world who are striving to improve the human condition within their countries, but typically doing so with the same sort of fossil fuel-oriented economies that we have used in the past as developed countries to reach the quality of life that we have, an economic standard that we have. And the need to address those issues has been a divisive, but at the same time important issue that there has been movement forward on. So following the initial negotiation by what's called the Conference of the Parties, which is what the meeting is in Paris. It's a meeting of those countries that are parties to the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, which coincidentally the U.S. is not. The Clinton administration set a goal and signed on, but they did not dare take it to the U.S. Senate in the politics of the 1990s as they saw it. And so we never ratified it. It did reach enough countries to ratify it, but countries like the U.S., countries like China, other countries without signing on to the agreement are still present as participants in the talks because really there's no point in having the talks without the major emitters there. So we had a prior deadline meeting that was set in Copenhagen in, I believe, 2009. This was a meeting that was supposed to generate the roadmap where we could peak our emissions and then make reductions as a world on into the future. Unfortunately, in Copenhagen, that agreement did not come to pass. What did emerge was a growing consensus that was acceptable to the majority of countries that we wanted to limit temperature change to 2 degrees Celsius from where we were now. But really there was no agreement coming out of Copenhagen as to how exactly we would get there. What followed that was the extension of the Kyoto Protocol in subsequent meetings, which was only agreed to by 37 countries. The U.S. did not join into the Kyoto Protocol at that point. The U.S. Senate has to ratify any treaty that we arrive at, and again, the politics were daunting for that, despite our continued participation in the talks. Mainly the EU and other countries, developed countries, made agreements to extend Kyoto to 2020. Canada, Japan, and Russia all stepped aside and said, no, we're not going to join this extension as examples of major emitters that are not on that program currently. But what we are looking at now in Paris in the coming weeks is trying to arrive at the next agreement that will bind countries from some point roughly around 2020 on into an as yet undetermined number of years. Basically, many of those issues are still open for negotiation, and there are parties that are vehemently opposed to a 2 degrees centigrade rise, that want to see something more like a 1.5 degrees centigrade rise, and there are other countries that are unwilling to limit their potential for economic growth the delivery of a higher quality of life or higher standard of living to their citizens by using fossil fuels, and are resisting meaningful agreements. You can say what you want about the United States. We, along with other countries, have offered commitments going into the Paris talks of what we would be willing to do for a certain number of years. And the U.S. has agreed, at least the Obama administration is proposing a 26% reduction in U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases below 2005 levels by 2025. The European Union, on the other hand, is proposing to reduce their emissions to 40% below 1990 levels, so that's obviously a deeper cut than just 40% from 2005 levels, which were higher, by 2030. China and the United States negotiated an agreement that is really more of a memorandum of understanding, where China made a commitment to peak its emissions of CO2 by 2030. So it would be allowed to continue to grow in its total emissions, and especially in CO2, until that date. And then in 2030, they have agreed to essentially cap their CO2 and hold it steady at that point. Other developing countries have made other commitments. They've made commitments along the lines of 10 to 30% less emissions than is projected by what's called business as usual. That means we're going to take a 10 to 30% cut in the amount of fossil fuel emissions we deliver to the atmosphere below what we're expected to grow into. So it's not an absolute reduction, it's a slowing of the growth of emissions by those countries that they've pledged by and large to this point. And India, another major emitter who is expected to pass China's population sometime in this century, the exact date is escaping me, but China, having surpassed the United States as the world's leading emitter in absolute emissions back in the late 2000s. India may even pass China, given their expected population growth. They have committed to reduce their emissions intensity, meaning that they will emit less emissions per unit of gross domestic product, or GDP, a measure of economic growth, by 35 to 40%. Well, many projections assume that we're going to get about a 40% reduction in energy intensity just by virtue of improved technology and efficiency. So India is not really proposing much more than business as usual in terms of its commitment. So some folks have modeled what this will put us at, the various commitments that have come forward. And while this is not necessarily a fully worked up model, it does give us information to think about where are we headed. And that's with the current commitments. We're looking at about a 3.5 degrees centigrade rise in global temperatures by the year 2100. That's obviously well above the 2 degrees centigrade countries contemplated in Copenhagen and have been sticking to largely as kind of their overall goal on into the future in subsequent negotiations and headed into Paris. So one way to look at this is, wow, we are not doing so well. Another way to look at this is that the commitments that the parties are making, that countries are making, and the movement of developing countries to recognize the need to do something about their emissions is progress. And while it may be not as much as we might desire, as fast as we might want it, if we can get agreements to these commitments and make them more binding, it will in fact move us toward that goal. And continuing negotiations can happen after Paris to try and improve our ambition, as it is called within the lingo of the climate negotiations. So that's where we are headed into Paris. And The thing I would say, too, especially to this audience and on the topic of tonight, is that it's interesting. Faith is something that transcends political boundaries. And in some ways, therefore, offers a kind of unique lens to act on an international level on a platform that is well beyond the political realm of any single state in the world, which is a powerful thing in multinational negotiations. And the second thing, closer to home, is that increasingly, my observation would be that U.S. politicians are increasingly paying heed, or at least paying lip service, to faith community perspectives. And so I don't know that the faith community has ever been better positioned to have an influence than right now. And so, in recent decades, in any event. And so I think there's much to be encouraged about, and I urge you to have a full and fruitful discussion with the remaining speakers. Thank you, and again, sorry that I have to leave.
Joseph Carver, the pastor at St. Francis Xavier, and I feel completely at home here because there are so many people in the back rows. It is good to be here. Other than being my favorite job as pastor of St. Francis Xavier here in Missoula, I'm a Jesuit priest and taught for many years in ecology. My background is actually in water ecology and biochemistry, and taught for many years at varying levels in that area, and that's what I do most of my writing in those areas. The Catholic Church has often been very slow to come to speak about anything regarding the environment, and the popularity of Francis has roared that to the forefront with his publication and promulgation of Laudato Si. His predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict, did make statements around climate change and around the environment. Many people say, really? I had no idea they did. But without the kind of incredible popularity that Pope Francis has, those were often missed. Ever since he walked onto the balcony following his election, unencumbered by an ermine cape, he seems to have been received with a newfound welcome. And maybe it's the scuffed black shoes. I'm not quite sure. But Francis has put a decidedly human face and voice on the church. And he has intentionally and powerfully opened the doors of the church to let the air of the world flow in and the faith of Christ flow out. What we have in Laudato Si is a deeply incarnational document. A little bit of context before I dive into the text of Laudato Si. With the publication of his first independent encyclical, Laudato Si on the care of common home, Francis is taking his most important step in guiding the Catholic Church out of the fortress of dogmatic defensiveness and into the city square, as I would call it. An encyclical is one of the highest forms of church teaching, surpassed only by the documents of an ecumenical council. So those of you who understand a bit about the formation of the Catholic Church, that Vatican II would be one of those councils. But what Francis is doing is using the highest form, the most important form that he has, to talk about what he sees as the most pressing issue of our time. Others that have preceded him have used this kind of church teaching. John the 23rd wrote a very famous encyclical, Pacem in Terris. Paul VI with his Populorum Progressio, and there are many other examples that we could cite here. But what is unique about what Francis is doing with this particular encyclical is this is not addressed to Catholics. It is addressed to the world community. Now, it may seem a very small thing, but when you look at that opening statement in his prologue, what he is addressing, he's addressing the life of all peoples and creation. There is no longer the separation of the true, and that is reflected more deeply as you dive into the document more and discover what Francis is talking about with his notion of integral ecology. A few other things about the context that I think are helpful. One of the things when I'm looking at a scholarly work, the first thing that I will read is I will go back to the bibliography and say, well, what is this person actually drawing from? And the fact that when you read through that very complete bibliography, you find references to the UDH, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. You find references to the Earth Charter. You find references to a Sufi mystic. When was the last time a pope quoted a Sufi mystic? You find references to Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit paleontologist that I heard some of you talking about earlier, and his writings on the Divin Milieu, and his writing on the hymn of the universe, and the fact that the universe is accelerating toward a particular omega point. This is a pontiff who is gleaning from the Eastern Orthodox Church as he quotes the primates from those churches, as well as from the Eastern traditions. This is not a document that comes solely out of the Catholic tradition, as so many of the documents and the encyclicals have come before. He does, in fact, draw deeply from his predecessors and from other papal encyclicals. But the breadth and depth that he reaches, and all you have to do is look at that bibliography, that you see what he is doing in establishing this context. The other thing that's important before we dive into the chapters is the work itself is divided into 6 chapters, which mimic the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. And that is a paradigm of understanding and of teaching that the Jesuits have used for about 450 years. So this paradigm begins always with context, and then moves into experience, and then demands reflection on what has just been experienced before a decided action is determined. And then there is an evaluative process at the end. So it's context, experience, reflection, action, and evaluation. When you look at how Laudato Si is divided up, you see that Ignatian pedagogical paradigm outlined beautifully in the structure, the very structure of the document. So what does all that mean? It means that the way the document is laid out is as much about how it is teaching as the document itself. So when he begins in that first chapter, what is happening to our common home, he is not trying to engage climate change deniers, because we all know that the greatest discovery of the scientific enterprise is that if you leave hydrogen gas alone, uninterrupted for 14.9 billion years, you get giraffes and rose bushes and human beings. And what he's doing is he's taking the critical issues of the time in that first chapter, and he's saying what is happening to our common home, and it is not stated as a question. He's not asking it as a question. He's stating it as a declarative and an imperative even. What is happening to our common home? And he then dives into citing scientific examples of pollution, of climate change, of an issue that I have been writing on for years on the role and the morality and ethics surrounding water and the privatization of water. That as water becomes more and more privatized, is it become then and sold on the market? Then is it become a right? Is water then a right or a privilege? And he's very clear in his engagement of that. But then he goes a little deeper, and he looks at, in our common home problem, he looks at the loss of biodiversity. And he cites very clear examples of the Congo and other rainforests, as well as the Amazonian rainforest. Then he does something at the very end of that first chapter that to me is the coup de grace in engaging the anthropocentrism that has permeated so much of Catholic social teaching and our own understanding, and what continues to feed those voices who are climate change deniers. And he looks at what he calls the throwaway culture. The throwaway culture that has so gripped the United States in particular and the world. Continuing that establishing of context, he moves on to the second chapter in the Gospel of Creation, as it's entitled. And he looks at environmental degradation, and he's trying to articulate, and I think he does it quite well, what we just heard, which is that through the lens of faith, we can transcend the sectarian divisions that we have experienced so often in our attempts at dialogue. And he confronts head-on the anthropocentrism of our human way of thinking, and in particular, the Catholic Church talking about stewardship of creation. That language of stewardship that has permeated language of faith communities for nearly 50 years or more. He's saying that what we're doing there when we continue that anthropocentric point of view is we perpetuate the power over dynamic, and we do not acknowledge the fact that humanity is derivative of, not primary to, creation. And until we begin to understand ourselves as derivative of and not primary to creation, we will continue to perpetuate this kind of environmental degradation. So he calls it a tyrannical anthropocentrism, in that it's right at the end of the second chapter, if you're taking notes. In the third chapter, he looks at the human roots of this ecological crisis. And here is where he clearly brings out the big guns, and he talks about the technocratic paradigm, that we have to accept, and we have accepted the technological products, but we need to accept as human beings that those products that we are so deliciously addicted to. I don't know if you've gone without your phone for 48 hours, if you start to twitch perhaps, but that the technological paradigm and the technocratic paradigm, he says that those products and the technology itself is not neutral. That has so changed our culture and placed the human person in the center, and in some cases replaced the human person at the center with technology at the center. And it's quite an indictment, and he says it this way. We have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. Things that are at first luxuries or oddities, digital cameras or smartphones, quickly become necessities in the minds of consumers, thus empowering not the consumer, but the producer. When I was in college, a cell phone was about this big. It was about that thick, and it was called the brick, right? I didn't have one. But now it seems that we replace them, about once a year. He looks at this kind of modern anthropocentrism and how it manifests itself in our culture, and he's talking about a distorted sense of individuality that turns everything but one's own self, and sometimes even that, into an object. And one's personal desires, both empowered by technology and wealth, above both the humanity of others and the structure of reality. So when he talks about this technocratic paradigm, he's talking about the replacement of the human person and of creation at the center. And he's talking about, it's a warning to all of us. In his fourth chapter, he rolls out, I believe, what would be his call to reflection if we're following along that Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. And he's asking us to reflect on the notion of the phrase he has coined in this encyclical of integral ecology. In short, he's saying it's all about relationship. It's relationship between living organisms and the environment in which they develop. He is clearly drawing from the works of Thomas Berry and Teilhard de Chardin and others who have been writing about this for nearly 100 years. What he is getting at is the fact that the universe is a communion of subjects. A communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And we have, from our first awakening to the universe, our first impression Our first impression when we see the beauty of a stargazer lily, for example, is not one of separation, but one of communion. When we see a tree or see a sunset or the ocean or anything in the natural world, our first impression is one of communion. And we have separated ourselves from the natural world. If I were to ask all of you to tell me about your experience of God, where is it that you experience God most profoundly? I'm sure very few of you are going to say, well, I was reading Thomas Aquinas the other night. But you're going to tell me the story of, I'm about to ski down a mountain and I just want to pause for the briefest of moments to take it all in because it's so beautiful. You're going to tell me stories of what it's like to walk on the beach at night and do what I call star stomping, when the phosphorescence glows just for a moment under your feet as you're treading down the beach. You're going to tell me a story about your first communion experience with the natural world. And what Francis is doing in this encyclical is he's talking about the Gospels, the traditional Gospels, yes, but he's also talking about the gospel of creation. And he's looking clearly at saying, what is it that the natural world has to teach us? In this 5th chapter, he looks at lines of approach and action steps, again, following perfectly the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. And what he begs for is not the wagging finger or the fist pounding that we have been hearing for so many years from the environmental movement, but he's calling us into an act of love, an act of dialogue, an honest and open dialogue. But he does this with deep intellectual roots. He draws at this point from his predecessors in his advancing the notion of the common good, and he does something very deftly with the distinguishing of different kinds of rights. He talks about the distinction. In particular, he references the ownership of property. And he talks about the distinction between absolute rights versus legitimate rights. And he's just distinguishing because he's saying clearly that ownership of creation or of property or land or water rights is not an absolute right. And yet that's what the way the market would treat us, and that's the way we have grown up and been assimilated into our culture to think of those kinds of ownership of creation as an absolute right. And it is not, according to Laudato Si, according to Catholic social teaching. But he does talk about it as in terms of a legitimate right. An absolute right, for example, an example of, I'm seeing these faces look at me with furrowed brows. An absolute right would be protection against torture, that we all have an absolute right in that way, versus a legitimate right that is guaranteed by the law of a particular land. Finally, in the 6th chapter, he goes on to talk about ecological education and spirituality. And what he does there is he looks at the role of human freedom in particular. And when he is doing this, he is outlining for us a way of saying, how is it that we lead people to believe that they are free as long as they have supposed that freedom as a freedom to consume, and he attacks that head on. That our human freedom doesn't entitle us to be free to consume. That human beings, while capable of the worst, he says, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good and right and true, simply because it is good and right and true. And I invite you to think, if you've ever looked at the lines outside the Apple store when a new phone is released, or at the ratings of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, or at the profits from the pornography industry, we can easily see what Francis is referring to when we're talking about the commodification of the world. When we look at those kinds of examples, we can hear clearly his clarion call to an ecological conversion. And his invitation to dialogue is really, I believe, an invitation for all of us, an invitation into the long view. The long view, which means strength that joins with our strength. The long view that means that we are not the center, but a part of something so much greater. The long view means seeking what is possible not what is expedient or cheap or easy. The long view means seeing the world around us as astonishing and as an invitation for conversion and transformation, and the learning from the least in our world, the least in the persons of the world, the poor of the world, the indigenous of the world, and to be astonished by what teaching is coming forth. The long view, I believe, changes the choices we make, how we have fun, what we do, what commitments we make, what surprises us with joy. And I believe what Francis is trying to tell us in Laudato Si is that the long view lives in each one of us, and we must search for it. Thank you.
By way of transition, I have to say, growing up as a good Catholic boy, we always thought that one of the priests were not known for good preaching. But that's changed. That was a wonderful, wonderful homily. If I'd had more of that as a child, that would have been really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Which of these buttons do I push, Abby?
Dan, you're always welcome at St. Francis.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I was asked to speak on religious perspectives on engagement and climate change here, and what I'm going to do is to move from the beautiful depth of engagement we have with the Catholic social teaching and the words of Pope Francis. And I was furiously taking notes because I'm going to be teaching Laudato Si this next semester in my Greening Religion graduate class, and I've read it several times, and there's such wisdom found in there. But the good news that I want to share tonight, at least I think it's good news, is that this beautiful wisdom is not found only in the Catholic tradition when it comes to embracing creation. It's actually found in virtually every one of our world religions and faith traditions. And the other good news is virtually all of them are coming out with very profound statements on climate change. The challenging news is getting it from the statement level into the pews to get people to act on it there. And that's the challenge for all of us who participate in faith communities. How do we take seriously the teachings of our communities when it comes to climate change here? And so I put up this little one here that has just a cluster of different faith responses that you can find when it comes to climate change here. But notice the central thing here is God's good creation, that we act on behalf of the earth. And that's what I think you'll see. So tonight I want to give you some of the breadth of what's going on here, and I want you to encounter some of the actual words that are being used in these statements here. I warn you, there's too many words here, so I'm going to skip over some of them, but just to give us a sense about what's being said by the different faith traditions here. Now, I start, though, with this graphic, which many of you have seen something on this here. It asks this question, is global warming real? And if you can see up at the top there, there's the total U.S. population that says roughly half agrees that, yes, it's real and it's being caused by human activity. Another 20% says it's real and being caused by patterns. And as you go through the different religious categories here, what you begin to see is the pattern that's emerging in terms of religious communities and how they respond to these issues here. And so part of the challenge that we have, and this is not news to any people here, is there's a large gap between public and scientific perceptions on climate change here. So on the left-hand side there, you see the column of different groups here in terms of the human role in global warming there. And very, very large scientific consensus on the left, very little consensus of the public perceptions on the right there. And so this is part of the challenge we have as to how to begin to move this here. One of the things that's so profound about the Pope's encyclical is he starts it with science. And I bring that up because I teach in a class where we actually read parts of the Pope's encyclical here, and many of my students perceive that there is a fundamental conflict between religion and science. That if you're religious, you can't believe in science. If you believe in science, you can't be religious. And so it's really, really important that one of the first things that the Pope did, the leader of the world's largest Catholic or Christian body, is he looks to the science, has that informs our faith reception or perceptions there. Let's see, get this. So this one here is what I also say is part of the good news, bad news notion here. If you look at this question about should I be concerned about global warming, roughly 50% of all Americans say yes in that there. But look at actually the Hispanic Catholics is a group that's even larger than that, and particularly if you look at Latin America, deep concern in Latin America. It's not coincidental, I don't think, that our Pope is the first Pope coming from Latin America. The Latin American Church has taken very seriously the intersection between social justice for the poor and care for the earth for many years, and that's being reflected, I think, in the Pope's leadership. But when we start getting down to some of the lower levels there, we begin to see, particularly among the white churches and white churchgoers, that's my group there, we see greater skepticism. And this is part of the concern I bring this up here is because I think this is also driving some of or reflected in the political polarization that we have in this country here. I think one of the deepest tragedies of our country is that climate change has become a partisan issue. Should never have been a partisan issue. We need the perspectives of conservatives, liberals, all across the spectrum there in terms of how to resolve climate change. Am I messing? Oh, there. And so it's really a shame that one of our political parties now is actively in denying climate change and not working proactively that. But that's in part because they're responding to their base. And part of the base of the Republican Party is the Christian right, which has been the group that's been most skeptical of climate change. Although the good news is that's also beginning to change. So what I'd like to do today is do a scan of a couple different dimensions here. I want to do a scan of some of the religious statements that are out there to give us a sense about the breadth of how leaders in the religious tradition are speaking out on these issues, and then also a brief scan of some of the religious responses before I turn it over to Caroline, who will be talking about local responses that connect nicely with this here. And I'll do this sort of selectively in sample here so we get some notion on that. Now, as I mentioned, there's very diverse views represented in the United States here, and I put up two of the ones here that are oftentimes overlooked. One of my concerns sometimes is that the media, and this is not media bashing, there's very good reasons for this here, but tends to equate, for example, the Christian perspectives on climate change with evangelical Christian perspectives because they've been most vocal in that. But there's quite a bit more diversity than that here. And so you see, for example, in the black church has been strongly supportive of trying to deal with climate change and supportive of Obama's initiatives on that. Also, Hispanics have been a group that's probably been the largest supporter of moving on climate change, Hispanic Catholics in particular on that. So a couple different groups that show some of this notion here. I put this one up here because you don't need to be able to read this. You probably can't read this here. But this is just a sampling of all the different statements that are out there by different national and international bodies on climate change. If you just Google the religious statements on climate change, it'll bring up this page from the Interfaith Power and Light group that's been chronicling this here. And just, if you want to become encouraged, just pull some of these statements up and read them to give a sense about that here. Now, I want to start first, though, with indigenous peoples, because indigenous peoples have been some of the most vocal peoples on climate change and some of the most deeply threatened by that. And you see that, for example, in activism around the tar sands here. So let me just read for a moment some of the statements on this here. This is from the Mystic Lake Declaration, which was a gathering of different indigenous tribes and tribal groups there a few years back to come together to talk about climate change. And they said the following: indigenous peoples must call for the most stringent and binding emission reduction targets. We call for national and global actions to stabilize CO2 concentrations below 350 parts per million. Unfortunately, we've already surpassed 400 parts per million. And limiting temperature increases to below 1.5%. This is a more stringent standard than what they're trying for at the climate change talks. They go on to say, we challenge climate mitigation solutions to abandon false solutions to climate change that negatively impact indigenous people's rights, lands, air, oceans, forests, territories, and waters. These include nuclear energy, large-scale dams, geoengineering techniques, clean coal technologies, carbon capture, and sequestration, biofuels, tree plantations, and international market-based mechanisms such as carbon trading offsets. They say the only real offsets are those of renewable energy developments. We're actually displacing fossil fuel generation there. So indigenous peoples have been looking particularly at both the effects of climate change, but also their concern about the solutions and their impact on indigenous peoples in the earth, and making some of the strongest claims on that. We've already seen in depth here a talk tonight about Pope Francis' leadership, but I want to emphasize again how transformative this is being, not only within the Catholic Church, but within faith communities all around the world. This is already even showing up in polls, that just a few months after the emission of Laudato Si, we're seeing people of faith beginning to take seriously this and move here. I'll read you a little bit later here a statement from Jewish leaders who actually said they had felt compelled to come out with this statement because of the Pope's example there, that had been so influential to them. But the Pope is not alone, and particularly in the international realm here. In fact, in many ways, the Catholics and Protestant churches have trailed behind our Orthodox sisters and brothers, particularly the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, and my spell check didn't catch that, that's the ecumenical, and the Orthodox who have been long active in this leadership here. And I just put up this quote from the Global Climate Change, a Moral and Spiritual Challenge, a statement emitted 8 years ago. In order to make the required changes, we are called to pray first and foremost for a change in our personal attitudes and habits, in spite of any accompanying inconvenience. Such is the depth of the metanoia, or repentance. The issue is not merely our response to climate change, but our failure to obey God. We must live in a manner that is consistent with what we believe and how we pray. Nevertheless, we cannot stop there. We must raise the issue before public officials and elected representatives at the city, state, and national level. Now, I put this up here. It's just a short excerpt from the statement there, but there's a pervasive pattern that emerges over and over across these different religious traditions. Almost infallibly, these statements start from a position of gratitude. Deep gratitude for the grace abundance that we've been given to live on this earth and this planet here. And then they move into the concern that we failed in our responsibility to take care of that. And then they usually couple them at two different levels. One is our individual response and our response within our personal lives, within our faith communities, but they rarely stop there. They also call on people of faith to engage the public sphere, that we have to engage the public sphere in the policy issues there, that personal change alone is not enough. And I bring that up because, again, this is a stereotype I encounter oftentimes with my students who equate being religious with being passive in the public realm. And the statements here make just the opposite argument, that we need to engage the public sphere here. So look at how the Worldwide Anglican Communion talked about this. This is the churches of England and all around the world here. They say, at this time of unprecedented climate crisis, we call all our brothers and sisters in the Anglican Communion to join us in prayer and in pastoral, priestly, and prophetic action. We call with humility, but with urgent determination, enlivened by our faith in God, who is Creator and Redeemer, and by the pain of our people's experience of our dioceses and provinces, and their need for seeds of hope in different ways. Each of our own dioceses are deeply impacted by climate injustice and environmental degradation. The Anglican churches here have lifted up a very important issue that you see time and again in religious communities, and that's the linking of the environmental impacts of climate change to the disproportionate impact on poor indigenous communities and communities of color, what we call environmental injustice there. And in this statement here, they link up 4 communities in particular. That climate change is having a disproportionate impact on indigenous peoples, on women, particularly poor women, who are oftentimes very dependent on natural resources such as firewood, on the poor, and on the youth, who are going to have to live with the effects of this here. And so they call for linking action on climate change with action on environmental justice consistently at all levels here. Now, we move out then, and just to give you some samplings of the breadth of these different perspectives here, this is a statement that a Buddhist declaration on climate change that came out in May of this year called "The Time to Act is Now." And here are a few excerpts in there. Today, we live in a time of great crisis, confronted by the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced, the ecological consequences of our own collective karma. I bring this up because what you see in each of these statements is that each tradition trying to grapple within the framework of their own understanding. And in the Buddhist tradition, karma is a very important concept for the moral accountability to our actions. And so that our actions have deep, resonating consequences, not only for ourselves, but for our world, not only in the current time, but for years to come. And so Buddhists are wrestling with this notion of ecological karma. What are the consequences of our ecological actions here? So they go on to say here, our present economic and technological relationships with the rest of the biosphere are unsustainable. To survive the rough transition ahead, our lifestyles and experiences must change. This involves new habits as well as new values. The Buddhist teaching that the overall health of the individual and society depends upon inner well-being and not merely upon economic indicators helps us determine the personal and social changes we must take. The Buddhist tradition, I think, has been the richest tradition of all in terms of really showing how deeply ingrained patterns of addiction are to unhealthy actions, and the need to take an inner dimension of understanding this, that we need to change the material reality, the social relations, but we also have to deeply our own attachment to the behaviors that are driving this here. And Buddhist emphasis on detachment from greed, from delusion, are really central to this here. And so I won't read this here, but they talk about both what needs to be done individually, but notice also the institutional change they emphasize, that we need to, as they say, decarbonize our systems as quickly as possible. Now, a few things here, again, from the rabbinic letter on the climate crisis that just came out in October this fall here. As I mentioned before, this is a group of American rabbis who were inspired by the Pope's declaration and looked and turned to the Jewish tradition as a way of beginning to articulate a case within Judaism here. So just highlight a few things here. Notice they started off here, the unity of justice and earth healing. This is a deeply biblical perspective that Jews and Christians share, that justice and earth healing must go hand in hand. And so they say the worsening inequality of wealth, income, and political power has two direct impacts on the climate crisis. Notice what they call here. On the one hand, great carbon corporations not only make their enormous profits from wounding the earth, but then use these profits to purchase elections and to fund fake science to prevent the public from acting to heal the wounds. On the other hand, the poor in America and around the globe are the first and the worst to suffer from the typhoons, floods, droughts, and diseases brought on by climate chaos. If you read the full text of this here, the Jewish rabbis here are drawing deeply on the biblical tradition of confronting empire and confronting the dynamics of empire, in this case being expressed through corporate structures that prioritize profit over earth care here. And so they name this very concretely in there. And so they draw on the wonderful Jewish tradition of what's called tikkun olam, which is the Jewish notion that we have the duty to repair the earth. So we call for a new sense of eco-social justice, a tikkun olam that includes tikkun tevel, the healing of our planet. We urge those who have been focusing on social justice to address the climate crisis, and those who have been focusing on the climate crisis to address social justice. These have to be addressed simultaneously and together in this tradition here. Now, there's too much text on here, but I just put this one up here just to note here that the rabbis don't leave this at the level of kind of broad abstract principles. They become very, very specific, and they talk here in this little fund here about what Jews can do with their monetary resources, to actually use the resources in the Jewish communities there to actually withdraw from funding our fossil fuel donations and then investing in the change we need to sustainable energy. Very similar, I might add, to the program of Reinvest Montana here, our student group that's active on campus of trying to get the university to divest from our money from fossil fuels and reinvest it in sustainable directions here. The other of the Abrahamic traditions, Islam, has also been moving more actively into this area here. And this is an Islamic declaration on global climate change that came out of a fantastic gathering in Istanbul this summer here to try to address these issues here. Notice again what they link here, not only climate change, but contamination befalling the atmosphere, soil erosion, deforestation, desertification, damage to human health. And they go on then to argue about that even though we are a small part of the divine plan, we have extreme responsibility for what we need to be doing here. All right, let me move to a couple different things here. The call to action here, again, some very, very concrete things that they talk about here. Lead the way in phasing out greenhouse gas emissions. Provide that the wealthy nations in particular need to provide generous financial and technical support to the least well-off. This is one of the things that Len Broberg was talking about that's coming up in the climate change talks about how do we institutionalize justice at the international level on that. All right, so I could go on. There's many, many other ones here. The Dalai Lama has been very proactive in this here. The Sikhs for climate justice have a very profound statement out there. Hindus have very fun stuff. The point is that virtually every one of our spiritual traditions have been active in coming up with very strong statements on this. And so the key becomes then how do we begin to move from those statements there to act on this? A real positive sign of hope is even the Academy is getting involved in this here. My own guild is the American Academy of Religion. Our annual meeting last year, the entire focus was on climate change there. All the plenary addresses were focused on climate change. Bill McKibben came and spoke on that there. The president of the American Academy of Religion, Lori Zoloff, gave her presidential address on interrupting life and ethics for the coming storm there. It was an amazing thing to see this academic body of about 10 to 12,000 folks there. And to give you some sense about this, my beloved and esteemed Professor James Cone in my graduate school said, attending academic religious conferences is a little bit like going through a garbage dump in hopes of finding something good to eat. We're really adept at focusing on lots of very abstract, esoteric things, but last year we focused on climate change, and it was really exciting to see even the Academy beginning there. And the last thing I would say is, even the folks that I've oftentimes wrestled the most with, my evangelical Christians, sisters and brothers, are also making some really progressive and important signs in this here. If you get a chance sometime, Google the name Katharine Hayhoe. She's an absolutely fascinating person. She's a climate scientist who teaches at Texas A&M. She's also a very devout evangelical Christian. And she is able to speak to evangelical Christians because she comes from a point of evangelical faith. She's also a deeply trained climate science. Her teachings, her writings, her speaking are making inroads in the evangelical churches that are really important on that area there. The other thing, for which I have a lot of hope, is young evangelical Christians. They're in a different place, I think, than their parents are on this issue here. They're taking seriously the whole notion of creation care as being central to their faith there. And so we're seeing some really important movement. There's still obstacles in this area here, but even the Southern Baptist now have a Declaration on Environment and Climate Change, which is a really important step there. So that's what I would say are some of the signs of hope. There are some really good resources out there for the faith communities. Interfaith Power and Light has chapters all around the country as well as a national group. It's good resources. A good friend of mine runs a group called Green Faith, which is all about greening our congregations and getting involved in that area there. And I also put up here, my colleague Caroline is going to speak next here. We have some wonderful local resources here. I saw Claudia Brown here earlier there. She's very involved in the Transition Street movement here. We also have the Missoula Climate Action Initiative here. So thanks very much here, and let me turn it over to Caroline. Maybe I've lost it.
Great. Thanks for that really easy transition. And thank you to Faith and Climate Action for organizing this amazing event. As Abby mentioned, I'm here representing Climate Smart Missoula, and we are the hub that hopes to foster partnerships and actions around climate change in Missoula. Everything we do is working towards a vibrant and resilient Missoula with a zero carbon footprint eventually, and all the networks we need to address future climate issues in an equitable way. So what I hope to do in the next couple of minutes is take all these wonderful abstract thoughts and all the momentum that's going on the global level, take it down to the local level, tell you a little bit more about what Climate Smart is doing, the projects we're pushing forward, and hopefully give you some ideas for how you can get involved in the future. So a little bit about Climate Smart. We just publicly launched at the end of this past summer. We found a home with the Missoula Community Foundation, and we're thrilled to be there. Even though it's pretty recent public launch. This is the work of years of community input and really wonderful partnerships and collaboration. The result of all of that work came about through a series of community conversations and summits, and through that process we came out of that with 12 different buckets or focal areas to help us group the challenges that climate change is posing towards the Missoula community, and also a way for us to organize the goals and strategies that we have around those challenges and hopefully to move our community forward in the right direction. We have a range of buckets from local food and agriculture to transportation to zero waste. I guarantee you that if there's something you're interested in the world of climate change, we can connect you to the people who are doing great things in whatever area you're interested in. Again, this summer in July, we rolled up all this work into our official Climate Smart Action Plan version 1.0, which groups all of the conversations we've had about these issues, lays out goals within each of the buckets, and also pretty concrete strategies to help us move forward. I encourage you to go out and read the plan. It's on our website, climatesmartmissoula.org. Read some of it, read all of it. There's lots of good stuff in there. Right now, Climate Smart is pretty small. It's myself, Amy Sillenberg, our fearless leader, who wishes she could be here tonight, but family obligations kept her away. And then we also have an AmeriCorps member who helps us out. And because of staffing and that limited capacity, we really wanted to make sure that we were going to be deliberate in our first year and make sure we could have the most impact in this community with the resources we had. And through that process, we saw that there were 3 really strategic opportunities for us to become more public in the community, and we coalesced around 3 projects. So one is the first ever community carbon emissions inventory. You may have heard that the city is doing one of these. They did one in 2008, led by Robin Saha, a professor at the university, and a group of students. And then this past year, we finally updated it in 2014. So we want to do that same thing for the community. We need to know what our carbon footprint is, because if we have a goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, which Climate Smart does, we need to know where exactly we're starting. We have no idea what our numbers are, but we need to establish that baseline if we're ever going to move in the right direction. And along with that process, we're working with our bucket leaders to identify the best measurements that we can take moving forward for that specific bucket, because we want to be able to measure progress, and we want to be able to come back to this community with as much transparency as possible and tell them what's working, what's not working, and take your feedback and criticism and make sure that it's a collaborative process moving forward. So we hope in March of this spring to come out with a pretty comprehensive report with our carbon footprint. We're in the midst of a lot of calculations right now, and hopefully some more information on the measurements that we'll be tracking every year moving forward from now. Another great project that was a wonderful opportunity for us to get involved with this fall is in our renewable energy bucket. Solarize Missoula, you may have heard of it. We're partnering with Montana Renewable Energy Association, the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the City of Missoula, and also the Missoula Federal Credit Union to increase residential solar installations. We're hoping to add about 50 to 65 new residential installations. So if you've ever thought about putting solar on your home, now is the time. We have a great group of qualified installers, some really wonderful rates that we've worked out with them, and also a pretty comprehensive financing package from both the DEQ and also the credit union. We have 2 events coming up for that, so if you have thought about it, please come this Thursday, the 19th, from 6 to 8 p.m. at the credit union location on Brook Street. You'll be able to meet the installers, talk to the steering committee. We can get you signed up right there. And then we also have a second information session on December 1st. It's a Tuesday from 7 to 9 p.m., and that's at the library. So that process, you will sign up, be assigned an installer, and they'll come out and do an assessment of your site and move the process forward to see if solar is right for you. And then finally, we have a project that this is our big showcase project called Summer Smart, Climate Smart. And before I get into it, can you raise your hand if you remember the smoke from this last summer? Yeah, exactly. So unfortunately, it seems like events like that, when the little dot around Missoula is in purple on that horrible DEQ website that I checked obsessively, might be coming more frequently in future years. And so Climate Smart realized that right now Missoula is not very equipped to handle days like that. We pray for rain or we hope the winds will shift, and that's pretty much our strategy. And we realized that's not sustainable. If we want Missoula to be resilient and strong, we need to have a system of action steps that we can take moving forward, and we need to have safety nets for the most vulnerable parts of our population. For people who can't drive out of the valley or don't have air conditioning, what do they do? Because they're breathing unhealthy air at a much higher rate than some other folks in our community. So this project, Summer Smart, Climate Smart, we're getting ready to launch it. We just got really exciting news that we won the Bloomberg Award in the Partners for Places granting process. So we were awarded a we were awarded a $45,000 matching grant to do this project, and we're really excited about it. So as I said, the first step is developing a strategic plan for what happens when the smoke comes in and the temperatures rise, making sure that we're looking out for everyone in our community and that they can take care of their physical health, their mental health, and figuring out how we can weather the weather, if you will. We also want to do this as creatively and artistically as possible. Sometimes the conversation around climate change can be pretty dim and pessimistic, and I know I fall into those traps sometimes as well. But it's important to remain optimistic and realize that we can face these problems in a fun way. So one example of that is we want to do artistic shade structures that are also solar charging stations. So if you're outside and you don't want to retreat to an air-conditioned box, you could seek refuge underneath one of these shade structures that we're hoping to collaborate with local high schools or university students or just community members to make them fun and engaging and give you a place to sit down when it's hot outside. We are also beginning a series of events in January. We're going to do a 12 by 12 feature of all of our buckets. So each month we'll take a bucket, have a series of events around it, some speakers, sometimes for just people who are interested in those issues to come together and chat. So please stay tuned for more information on that. Ways for you to get involved. The best way to keep in touch with us is on Facebook, so please like us on Facebook, Climate Smart Missoula. And please go to our website too. We try to post as much as possible there as well. There are a lot of great opportunities outside of Climate Smart, which were mentioned in your final slide. Transition Streets is great. 350.org, a lot of different organizations doing similarly great projects, just taking some different approaches. Another way to get involved, again, like I said, please come to our Solarize meeting if you're interested in putting solar on your house. And then if you find the issue of smoke in our community compelling, I would really encourage you to donate to our Summer Smart project. As I mentioned, it's a matching grant, so we either raise $45,000 and unlock the other $45,000, or we don't raise $45,000 and we don't get any of it, and that project's going to be a lot harder to push forward. So if you feel like you're in a place to donate, I know we would really appreciate it. Again, you can go to our website for that. And really, every dollar counts, and it's going to be matched 1 for 1. So it's a really wonderful opportunity to double your impact. And I'll just close by saying it is hard to think about climate change sometimes, and a lot of times the solutions to it and the ways to get involved can feel very abstract, like there's no way for an individual to make a difference. But there is a ton of momentum in this community, and there are so many dedicated people working towards this problem, and we are really primed for change and to create something really special here. So please get involved, please stay positive, and hope you'll join us in that process.
I'm John Lund, part of the Faith in Action group that has been working on this, and we want to give a chance for people to ask some questions. We are aware that a lot of our faith communities at times are wondering like how do we engage, how do we get involved? And so part of our conversation with Climate Smart Missoula is to say, can faith communities be part of that conversation, part of the solution? How do we engage at the local level? So thank you for presenting some of your work and what might be coming. But we want to give you all a chance to respond to, well, ask a question would be the best way to do that.
This is for Climate Smart Missoula. And basically, as you know, Missoula just passed 2 big bond issues for the schools. And I was just wondering whether there was any local input into those decisions because, you know, the schools are large purveyors of energy, and whether, you know, some energy saving things were going to come out of that.
Is this, yeah, okay. Thank you for your question. Yeah, we were working with the schools before the bond issue passed as they were thinking about upgrading some of their energy efficiency systems. Right now, Montana is one of a handful of states, 4 or 5 maybe, that does not have a LEED certified school throughout the entire state, which is a shame because we have a lot of really talented architects and engineers in this state, and we should not be left behind. So yes, Climate Smart and also the City of Missoula has been working with different school officials to make sure that part of the bond issue is shooting for LEED. That hasn't been officially adopted as one of their absolute goals, but there's a lot of excitement around that, and I know that a bunch of people want to make sure that happens.
I want to direct this to the 2 religious scholars who are both also scientists, I'm aware. I'm speaking as a religious scientist, grateful for the gift of creation and all too aware of creation's failing health. I'm very happy to see the Pope and the leaders of all these other spiritual traditions showing some real leadership in addressing one of the greatest challenges humanity's ever faced, and that they are drawing on science as well as moral philosophy in seeking a path. Well, given that since the 1960s, ecologists have said that the human population is exceeding and degrading the Earth's capacity to support life, and given that the London School of Economics has concluded that full access to family planning for all is by far the most cost-effective investment we can make in addressing climate change and all other environmental problems, and others have pointed out that it's an absolutely essential part of addressing poverty as well. Given all these guidances coming from scientists, can we hope that the leaders of all spiritual traditions will embrace the idea that access to full family planning services is an absolute human right and one of the greatest human duties to the earth?
I'm so shocked that this question came up. Do I think that the Catholic Church is going to change certainly in my lifetime? I don't know. With regard to whether it's natural family planning or whether that gets advanced into other forms of acknowledging the human impact and overpopulation of the earth and the degradation that follows that. What I can share very concretely is that what the Pope is looking at in particular with human impact and the sheer numbers and the degradation of the earth is he's looking at the disproportionate effects of those who are in first world nations and saying that one person in the first world has a far more dramatic impact on the earth and the footprint that they are presenting 4 times in the consumptive paradigm than someone in the developing world. So he is at the very least acknowledging the fact that the population is a contributing factor, which is huge that that's even being acknowledged. And then the second thing is he's acknowledging not just humanity, but he is distinguishing between the poor of the earth and those who live particularly on less than $1 a day, which is, 3 billion people on our planet home, and the disproportionate impact of those who are living in the first world. And he's saying that we cannot simply just say, as a blanket policy, we have to look at human overpopulation of the earth. He's saying we have to look at who is having the most significant impact.
Vicki, it's a little easier for me coming from the Protestant side of the Reformation in terms of the specific thing on family planning, but what I would emphasize here is I think there's a lot of common ground, even though the different faith traditions differ in terms of access to family planning, is whether or not that's a right. The other side of that, though, is that addressing climate change with social justice and legitimate development needs is a really critical linking there, because what we're seeing over and over again in the development world is that population rates fall most dramatically when girls and women have access to education and when we address basic social justice needs. Now, I also think it's really important to give women access to family planning and contraceptives. And so I would push hard for that being linked there, but out of respect to religious traditions that don't link that as well, I'm still encouraged that we have a lot of common ground in the other areas. And so I agree completely with Father Joe that whenever we talk about the effects of population, we have to link it to the effects of consumption, and the footprint of the developed or the wealthy nations is so much greater. That's not to say there are not significant concerns with population, particularly rapid population outstripping local natural resource bases, but that always has to be linked together with the role that we in the affluent nations have. I mean, just one example, I think it's somewhere to 20 to 25% of all the greenhouse gases emitted in China are emitted for producing goods for export to the wealthy nations there. And so even though we've exported our climate emissions to China, we are still responsible for the produce on that. I'm seeing 28% here. I know there's different ways of studying on that. And so it's a tricky issue. So I do think that integrated family planning is a really important part of addressing economic and social development. But I also encourage that there's increasingly consensus that we have to address environmental issues by also linking them to development and social justice issues. And I think the most important area of that is really addressing the needs of girls and women in the developing world.
I wonder if you could, is that on? Yeah, okay. I wonder if you could more thoroughly address how we address those members of the more right-wing Christian community who, frankly, having many relatives in that community, I would say that it's not an unfair characterization to say that they believe that there's an evil cabal of climate scientists out there who hate God, who hate America, who hate God's laws establishing unfettered free market capitalism as the one true faith, and that these climate scientists are out to destroy America and do it through the UN, through limiting carbon corporations. And, I've frankly given up on attempting to address my relatives on this.
Can you start? I'll offer two things to start, and then if any other on the table would like to join in. I get this question a lot as well. The first thing is that I don't try to change people's minds and folks who make my eyeballs switch sockets. When I get into those conversations where I sense my eyeballs are switching sockets, I know that I need to get out of that conversation. And I appreciated very much what Dan pointed out, which was the large percentage of those persons who are not deniers, but are unsure, uncertain, unread, uneducated about this particular issue of climate change, or about the degradation of the natural resources of the earth, particularly water. So to try to begin with not the conversion of those who are looking for a fight, because if they're looking for a fight, then nothing we're going to say engaging them is going to change those minds and hearts. So I don't begin there. I never have, and I hopefully won't. But instead, beginning with those folks who are unsure, and then to point them towards resources that you know are really clear and accessible resources. The second thing, and this comes from my own tradition as a Jesuit priest, is I wrote an article during the BP hemorrhaging that was going on, and it had to do with trying to change the imaginations of those who were perhaps coming from an evangelical perspective. And what I related the earth to was that the side of the earth had been pierced. And we will look on those in which has been pierced. And it was deliberately tying that directly to the Gospels and saying, how do we look on the side of the earth as piercing the side of Christ and take seriously the notion of the incarnation, which is so integral to Christian faiths, and saying, can we help go in through their door of a focus solely on, what is the doctrine and the teachings of that particular Christian faith, and draw them out using creativity and imagination through another door, to say, can we enter in through a dialogue that changes imaginations, and thus, in changing those imaginations, we begin to crack open what the Pope is calling for, which is dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. And so I would encourage you to be as imaginative and as creative as possible going in through their door. And so I said, well, what does it mean to look on the side of the one whom we have pierced? Because Deepwater Horizon was a hemorrhaging of the earth, there is no doubt.
Yeah, if I had the real answer to your question, I'd try and market it, and I could retire early here. But no, let me start with a different parallel, because this is a lesson that I learned for myself a long time ago. In the early 1980s, over 30 years ago, I started doing a lot of speaking in the churches about being a gay Christian. And in the early 1980s, that was not a very popular stance in a lot of churches. And it was pretty scary work a lot of times there. And early on, I made the mistake of trying to address my talks to the people who I thought were going to be most opposing me. And that was a dead-end strategy. What I realized in almost any group I spoke to about homosexuality and Christianity, or homosexuality in the Bible, was I could sort of see there were 4 groups there. One was the people whose minds I wasn't going to change no matter what I said. And the mistake I made was trying to address my talks to them. Then there were people who were genuinely open, who were just confused, really open to thinking, but they didn't have the information they needed. Then there were gay and lesbian people who needed a word of hope, and they hadn't heard much of that in the churches. And then there were families and friends of gay and lesbian people who cared deeply for them, but felt like the church had nothing to say to them about that. So what I started doing was addressing all my talks to the latter 3 groups, to the people who were genuinely open to learn, but were confused and needed more information, to the people who needed a word of hope because they were gay or lesbian, or to the friends and family members of gay and lesbian who cared deeply for them, but weren't hearing anything from the churches on that. I think we can do a similar thing when it comes to climate change in that area there. It's a mistake, I think, to always try to pitch it to people who aren't at a point where they're going to hear us there, because then the people who need to hear us are not hearing what they need to hear. And what I found time and again is if I just simply speak out of my own experience and try to address the concerns that people have and share what's there, that's where the majority of people are going to respond to that. Now, the second thing, though, I do think, though, there are ways sometimes to reach people who don't want to hear, and it's not easy. But the 2 questions that I oftentimes work with the people is I just ask you, what is it you most care about, and what are you most worried about? And what I find is that even people I'm on complete opposite side on the climate change issue, and it oftentimes comes down to theological issues. I just don't, they have a very different understanding of end times and theology and things like that than I may do. But what we care most deeply about oftentimes is pretty much in common. We care about our kids. I think a lot of people are very concerned about what you were talking about, the cabal of climate scientists feel like there's a conspiracy to rob their children of a future that they care deeply about. So if we start sometimes at the level of what we care most deeply about and what we're most concerned about, we can amazingly oftentimes find some common ground that it can at least open up some conversation. Not always. But the only thing I would say is that 3 decades after having all those conversations, I mean, in the 1980s, I would have bet my life savings that same-sex marriage would not have been legalized in my lifetime. That just was not even a possibility 3 decades to even think about. And it took a lot of slow work and a lot of people just talking, but we reached a tipping point. I mean, 10 years ago, we only had 1 state that had legalized same-sex marriage. Now it's legalized in all 50 states there. That's an amazing tipping point. I'm hopeful that a similar thing is happening on climate change. It takes a lot of just steady, slow, patient work at the grassroots level and continue to push our leaders on that. Both those have to happen there. But at a certain point, you reach a tipping point, and I'm already seeing it, frankly, in terms of my students. My students are at a very different place today than they were 10 years ago on the timid climate change. I mean, even the ones who are conservative pretty much accept it's there. There's a lot of resistance in other areas there, but I think there is some hopeful signs. We just have to keep pushing on it and remaining open and gracious, but still hold our politicians accountable. And then I hope we'll reach that tipping point. Caroline, do you want to address this at all as a member of the younger generation?
Sure. Well, I think you're seeing that same transition in the younger populations. That we don't really discuss whether or not climate change is happening. We just say, yeah, it's happening, and what are we going to do about it? Which seems almost like a harder problem to figure out sometimes. I think I used to work for the city, and we used a variety of techniques as well, you know, trying to talk to people about climate change on an individual basis and seeing which avenues we could use to get to them. Was it looking at changes in the land that they owned or looking at their utility bills? Just trying to use a variety of approaches to get somewhere. And I totally agree with what you said, is if you address your message only to the people who are never going to agree with you, the people who you really have the most hope at changing their minds get lost in that argument.
Okay, I'm just going to have to pipe in. I would say, Dan, that it was religious denominations, and I'm a Lutheran, you know, when the Lutherans finally kind of made a move on same-sex ordination or orientation, it was only a couple years later that marriage starts getting, and it wasn't the Luther, but the tipping point, religious communities got involved and made a difference. And perhaps this is the same kind of issue where faith communities have an opportunity, a responsibility, the ability to help the tipping point move forward. We'll come back here and then.
Oh, thank you. I was just thinking of one of my favorite organizations, the NRA, and what they do in Washington, D.C. And I'm of course joking, they're not my favorite organization, but but I was just wondering whether or not the faith communities have been moving towards some direction of pooling their resources and lobbying and looking in more effective ways of influencing our political leaders, because that's where the decisions are going to be made that we're going to have to live with. So I don't know if that's going on or not, but it seems like it could potentially have some effect.
I know that you see a lot of that collaboration, particularly in D.C., with groups that are looking at, and this is, I think, the most advanced so far, at those religious traditions that are coming together and looking at responsible investing and saying, okay, those companies that we are supporting with our donations, what is the most ethical investment portfolio that we can put together that isn't supporting, climate change or environmental degradation? And so looking at that, and that has been a real point of collaboration, I know, between many different religious traditions. And I think that one has the most traction now. I don't know if you have others you want to add.
No, I mean, Gary, it's a really interesting question, and one of the things that I think is sometimes a shame is that I think that the folks on the right are better at identifying when they're speaking out of a religious perspective that also has a political dimension than folks in the middle or on the left, and so you see a lot of mainline folks. I mean, I have a lot of colleagues here at the university, myself included, and for a lot of good reasons, we don't mix our faith with our public stances on things here. But the problem is that the vacuum then gets filled in, so that I think public perceptions are that to be religious means to be on the right. I think there are just as many people of faith who are strongly, deeply concerned about climate change, probably more, and are trying to work some of that. but we're not good oftentimes at getting out a public witness on that in a way that I think we probably need to. We just, in terms of really beginning to pool those resources so that we can say, this is a faith stance for me as well. And you know, I'm operating on principle out of faith on that. And that's one thing I think we can actually learn. I mean, the NRA does it well from a political stance, and I think some of our Christian brothers and sisters on the right do it better in that making that public witness there. But the downside is that we've let them fill the vacuum on perception on that. But
this question is for Joseph Carver. I believe I heard you say that we are derivative of, not primary to creation. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Sure, I can't see your face. So, oh, there you are, right there. I'm looking up in the back because I saw somebody waving. What do I mean by that we are derivative of rather than primary to? Essentially that when we look at, if we were to imagine a 24-hour clock starting at 0 and going to 2400 hours across the back part of this backdrop here, that human beings arrive on the earth at 23:59 and about 58 seconds, right? That's when we come into the story of the unfolding of the cosmos. That what we're talking about here with climate change needs to be set in the larger context of the cosmological story of, and when we look at that, of the evolution of the cosmos, while it may seem daunting, that we see that we are part of something that is so much greater than who we are. And that our presupposition that we are going to be in charge of, you know, creation and continue the kind of dominance that we have over the world's resources and the resources of all of creation, that we need to be humbled and reminded that we have just come onto the scene in the cosmological story, that at the 23rd hour, the 59th minute, and about the 55th second, if you look at the fact that the universe has been unfolding for nearly 14.7 billion years. So when I say that we are derivative of, that not primary to, and yet we continue to act as if we are primary when it comes to the engagement of the natural world and the resources of the earth. Does that help?
Yeah, how do you support that scripturally?
Well, I'd be happy to talk with you separately, not in this context, about how we can discuss that. The understanding of Scripture in the creation story is not meant to be a literal 7-day evolution. And if you'd like to discuss more of that, that is a much longer conversation than, at least at the time in this panel, we don't have time to, but I'm happy to chat with you about that.
We'll go maybe a couple more. There's one back here, and then...
Hi, I'm excited that this is happening, and I want to thank the panelists and everybody who's here. In October attended the Parliament of World Religions in Salt Lake City with 10,000 other people, and as I'm telling people about it in my life, I keep getting people's responses as if I just spent you know, a week with 10,000 clergy, which is really not what it was like. It was like the World Social Forum, like people of faith from many different traditions from around the world, and it was extremely moving. So I just want to say that what we're doing here is part of something bigger, that there's a real sense of momentum that happened there in Salt Lake City. The Parliament of World Religions has been gathering every 5 to 6 years, and they just decided to gather every 2 years because there's such a need. And there was a whole panel on climate change. A whole plenary session on climate change. There was plenaries on women and young people, and the indigenous presence was phenomenal. And a whole lot of that is available streaming online, so anybody wants more from after tonight, I encourage you to check that out. Thanks to the panelists.
Thanks, John. A couple of things. Number one, I've invited Carolyn, I've invited Amy to Sentinel Kiwanis. She'll be there speaking. I don't know if you're joining her in January, but we're also on the energy efficient building, our high efficiency building collaborative. So we're doing work together that way. Dan, you were talking about, or one of your slides up there had discussed about, just before the Buddhism slide, about someone's failure to listen to God with respect to climate change. It really toys with some of the belief systems depending on which side of or which interpretation of the Bible that you have, because I lived with a woman for a short time sharing a house, and we looked out to the east over at the Cascade Mountains, and she looked and sat back in the living room and said, God meant for us to take all those trees. So I have a real hard time when we have this conversation, when we have to hold it with, and perhaps sometimes against, people who don't share the same beliefs, that it is a concern. Which takes me to the final point, which is something Len was talking about, which had to do with CO2 reductions. And I know that recently, I think it was the president of Brazil was talking about, you know, you're asking my countrymen to stop the denuding of the forests, which are essentially recognized as the lungs of the earth. What's in it for us? Because we have to live too. So we have this combination of climate change effects with CO2. How do you perceive that we would approach and discuss that with the president of Brazil, saying, well, you got to do it. You're a third world developing nation. We've already developed. We've already screwed up. We've seen our bad ways. Now we're trying to change it, but we need you to not go in the direction we went.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to go into a long list of policy prescriptions here. I mean, that's the stuff that is being hammered out internationally, but I think the principle is sound, that we in countries like the United States and Europe and Japan, we have benefited greatly in terms of our standard of living and resource development on fossil fuels. And so we've gained a lot of positive gain from putting fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere, and it's patently unjust and unfair to tell other countries, A, that you have to freeze your development now, and B, that we're just going to close the door and expect you to do all the change. So I do think there's going to have to be international cooperation. There's going to have to be some sharing of resources or shifting of resources to particularly help poor nations figure out how they can do it. I mean, the one disaster would be, well, there'd be two disasters. One is to cut off much needed economic development in the poor world when they need it. And the second disaster would have them do that economic development following the path that we've pioneered. I mean, the Earth cannot have the kind of economic development go on that's fossil fuel based. We are the countries that have the technological basis and the resources to be able to pioneer something different, but they're going to have the moral obligation to make that available to poor nations as well. Now, there's a lot of schemes that you can do that where it can be mutually beneficial. But we also, I think, are going to have to come to terms with, we cannot continue living at the same kind of lifestyle and consumption of resources. I mean, Father Joseph was exactly right on in terms of the Pope's calling our, this crazy, wasteful consumerism culture that we have built up, and calling that, increased standard of living. We got to come to terms with that, and so there's going to have to be some greater simplification of our desires that we oftentimes call needs, coupled with working with a just solution to helping poor countries that have legitimate social needs to do it, but do it in a way that's sustainable. So that's a broad principle, Dave, rather than policy prescriptions. There's a lot of really interesting policy prescriptions out there I can't get into tonight, but I think the point is right on that. Let me address one other point here, just on how we view the resources of the earth, because this is it's a really interesting one, and it's shaped by the lenses we take to things in there. There are a lot of folks who said, the coal is a natural resource that God gave to us and blessed to us, and the natural resources, these are blessings that we have, and they appeal to the notion of dominion that's in the Genesis text there. The Pope has a wonderful reworking of dominion as really responsible stewardship, and dominion is the act of responsibility from refraining from consuming on that. But I also wanted to address a different, this may or may not be insightful for people. From a scientist's perspective, when we look at the fossil fuels that are in the ground, and this goes back to that whole notion of leave it in the ground, I think one can make a wonderful argument that God and God's anticipation of what climate conditions would need to be like for life to emerge as it has to evolve there meant that much of that carbon that was in the atmosphere tens of millions of years ago had to be sequestered in the ground. It was the only way that we're going to create the conditions for the life that we've had, the stable climate we've had for not only human life, but all the rich diversity of life we have here. And so God, in God's wisdom, sequestered all that carbon in the ground, put it down there as coal, put it down there as oil, and things like that. We, in our arrogance, have thought it was there for us. And took it all out. And now we're actually reversing all the conditions that God put in place to make the planet livable for human beings. I say listen to God. Leave it in the ground.
Well said. My students are sick of me saying for many times over, I would, when this or similar questions would come up, I would say again and again to them that an economy based on the consumption of fixed resources will have no option eventually other than to consume itself. And to try to point out again and again that we have to acknowledge that we are part of a finite system. And yet we have an economy, a global economy, that is based on an infinite access to these kinds of resources. And it simply isn't the case. And that when students would say to me, or I would say to them, you know, they would say, well, throw that away. I say, well, absolutely, as soon as you tell me where away is, because we live on a closed system. We are part of a closed system. And I would repeat that sense of an economy based on the consumption of fixed resources will have no option other than to consume itself.
I know there were a couple other questions, but I think we're going to cut it off for now, and if you can stick around and try to ask one of the speakers if you'd like to. But I just wanted to close by asking for your applause again for these wonderful speakers and for their time. Thank you all for coming tonight. If you're interested in following up on some of the things you've heard, this has been a wide-ranging conversation tonight covering a huge variety of topics, and we recognize that. And on the table out front, there's some information just about just a handful of some of the local initiatives that we've talked about tonight. But beyond that, we hope that this conversation has empowered you to continue the conversation in your own communities and to find ways to work together to address climate change. And if you're so moved, I would encourage you to sign up on the sheet out front for our Faith and Climate Action group. We have a meeting this coming Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at St. Paul Lutheran Church. And this is really a group of folks that's interested in thinking about this engagement and advocacy piece and how to take these statements from religious leaders and turn them into action and be a voice for change in collaboration on climate change. So we hope that you have a great evening, and thanks again for coming.